The morning the new house was finished, the whole village of Crandon Ford came down to the water to look at it, and Eleanor Wycombe stood among them with a basket of mended linen on her hip, and did not look at all. The house sat on the far bank of the Aval, a clean square of pale stone with green shutters, and a slate roof that caught the autumn light, close enough that a person on her side could count its 9 windows, far enough that no one on her side could be expected to walk to its door. The river between was low that month, brown and patient over its stones. People said the Duke of Harrowmere had built it. People said he had built it for a woman. No one said which woman, because no one would have believed the answer. And the woman herself said nothing, only shifted the basket higher, and turned back toward the lane where her work waited. To the village she was the seamstress at the ford, the quiet one, the one who took in mending and asked for her coin in advance because she had learned what a gentleman's promise was worth. To the better houses she was useful and invisible, a pair of hands that hemmed and turned and let out seams, and a face they did not trouble to remember between fittings. Mrs. Abbott at the inn had a name for her that she used kindly and often. Poor patient thing, she would say to the other women over the wash, sews for everyone, and is courted by no one, and the no one in the phrase was meant to be a comfort. Stay a while, and you will see what the village could not. You will see a woman, the world set on the wrong bank, and a man who could not say plainly the one thing that might have brought her over. Watch the river. It matters more than the house. She was 25 years old, and she had not always lived at the ford. There had been a different life once, in a different county, with a father who taught Latin to the sons of the gentry and a mother who played the pianoforte in the evenings until the candles guttered. That life had ended in the space of one winter, the father first and the mother soon after, and the small sums owed to small men had eaten what remained until Eleanor had walked out of the only house she had ever loved with a workbox and a folded letter, and the conviction that she would never again let her safety rest in any hand but her own. She did not call this a wound. She called it sense. The distinction was the whole of her trouble. The Duke of Harrowmere had come to the district in the spring. He had bought the old Marsden estate on the rise above the far bank, the one with the cold chimneys, and he had moved into it without a wife, without a hostess, without the train of glittering people such a man might have brought. Tristan Vale. The village learned his name was, though the village said, "Your Grace," and meant the name underneath. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair, worn slightly too long for fashion, and a face that held still in a way most faces did not, as if stillness were a thing he had practiced until it became cheaper than expression. Cheed in not. He rode the lanes alone. He did not dance, though the assembly rooms at Crandon would have stopped their music to make room for him. He had, the village agreed, the manner of a man who had decided a great while ago that warmth was a luxury he could not afford, and the agreement was offered with the particular relish a small place keeps for a great man's sorrows. What the village did not know was how the Duke had first seen Eleanor, because Eleanor had not seen him see her. It had been a wet afternoon in April, and a child had fallen in the lane outside the chandler's. A small, ragged boy who belonged to no one in particular, and was therefore everyone's to scold. And the boy had gone down hard on the wet stones and cut his hand on a broken crock. The village had stepped around him. A woman with a market basket had clicked her tongue and gone on. A man in a good coat had stepped wide of the blood, as though it might stain him at a distance. She had knelt in the mud in her one good gown, the gray one she kept for delivering finished work, the only gown that lifted her above the look of a charwoman, and she had not hesitated over it for so much as a breath. She had bound the boy's hand with a strip torn from her own petticoat, working the cloth tight and clean the way her mother had once shown her, and she had spoken to him low and steady, asking his name, telling him hers, asking what he had been running from, and laughing softly when he told her. Until the crying turned to hiccups and the hiccups turned to a watery grin. She had given him a penny she could not spare. A wage, she told him, for being brave. And bravery, she said, was always worth a wage, and he was to remember that, and never let a man tell him otherwise. She had not known that a man on a dark horse had drawn up at the corner and gone. Entirely still, she had not known he watched her ruin her good gown for a child who could never repay her. She had finished and risen and gone on, and the man had turned his horse and ridden home and sat a long time in a cold room, thinking about a thing he had believed was gone out of the world. That was the spring. The house was the autumn. Between the two there had been small things, the kind a careful woman notices and then teaches herself not to notice. A standing order for fine shirts that the great house had no apparent need of, paid for in advance, the coin always exact. A footman sent to ask with elaborate indifference whether the seamstress of the Ford would consent to look over the household linen. An errand a duke's establishment had no earthly reason to put in the hands of a village woman. A basket of pears left on her step in July with no card, and another in August. And she had eaten the pears because she was not a fool. And waste was a sin she could not afford. But she had not let herself wonder long about the hand that set them down. To wonder was to hope. To hope was to stand again on the bad edge of a promise and wait to be told it had meant nothing. She had done that once. She would not do it twice. He came to her shop himself only once before the house was built, and the village talked of it for a fortnight. It was a gray day at the end of summer, and the rain had come on suddenly, the way it does in that country, and the Duke had stepped in out of it, because her door was the nearest, and not, she told herself firmly, for any other reason. He stood in the small front room with the rain dark on the shoulders of his coat, and seemed to fill it entirely, and she rose from her stool, with her needle still threaded, and her heart, traitor that it was, climbing into her throat where she could feel it beat. He looked at the neat shelves and the folded work and the single chair by the cold grate, and something moved across his still face and was put away again. "You work too hard," he said. The words came out level, almost flat, a statement and not a kindness, and she heard them as a verdict on her circumstances and felt her face heat. "I work as hard as I must, your grace," she answered, and kept her eyes on her needle, and did not see how his hand had tightened on the brim of the hat he held. "Sit down," he said then. "You have been standing since I came in." It was a command, delivered in the tone a man uses to a servant, and she sat because one did not argue with a duke in one's own front room, and she did not understand, would not understand for a long while yet, that he had said it because her hands were shaking with cold, and he could not bear to watch her stand in it. He looked at the cold grate while she sat. He looked at it a moment too long, the way a man looks at a thing he means to remember. Then he asked her in the same flat voice whether she had wood enough for the winter, and she told him she had what she needed, which was not the same as enough, and which he seemed to hear the difference in, because his jaw tightened, and he said nothing more about it. He stayed only a few minutes longer. He bought nothing. He left a sum on the counter for shirts not yet ordered, more than the shirts could ever come to, and he set it down without counting it, as a man sets down a thing he does not want to be seen counting, and he went back out into the rain. Eleanor sat in the chair he had told her to sit in, and pressed her cold hands together, and looked at the coin on the counter, and called herself every kind of fool, until the trembling stopped. The dowager came in September. She was the Dowager Marchioness of Stane, the Duke's aunt by his late mother, a handsome, upright woman of 60. With a fan she carried like a small scepter, and a way of greeting people that adjusted itself, mid-sentence, to their rank. She had heard, in the way such women always hear, that her nephew had grown peculiar in the country, that he had refused 3 perfectly good invitations, and bought a worthless estate, and was rumored absurdly to take an interest in a person who sewed. She had come to mend it. She arrived at the great house with her own rival in tow, a polished cousin of impeccable family named Miss Lavinia Croft, fair and cool and beautifully dressed, who had been told her whole life that she was the correct sort of girl and had every reason to believe it. The dowager went to see the seamstress on the second day, on the pretext of a torn flounce, and she sat in the small front room and watched Eleanor work with the steady, assessing look of a woman pricing a horse. She found the work very good, and said so in the tone one uses to praise a clever animal. She found the woman composed, which displeased her, and clean, which she had not expected, and possessed of a quietness she could not at once classify, and therefore distrusted. When she rose to go, she paused at the door, and delivered, in the soft voice of confidential kindness, the sentence she had come to say. "My dear," she said, "you must not let the foolish talk of a village turn your head. A man of my nephew's position does not marry where he buys his shirts. You are a sensible creature. Be sensible." And she went out to her waiting carriage, leaving the words to do their work, which they did, for they were only what Eleanor had told herself 100 times in her own voice. And there is no verdict that lands so heavily as the one that agrees with us. That was the first voicing. And Eleanor folded it away with the others and bent her head over her needle, and did not weep, because weeping spoiled fine cloth, and the cloth was the only thing in the world that was reliably hers. The Duke did not court her after the conventional manner, because he did not know how, and because the conventional manner would have required him to risk a thing he had decided long ago, never to risk again. He had been married before. Few in the district knew it, and none knew the whole of it. But there had been a wife, years ago, a gentle, frightened girl married to him at 20 by 2 ambitious families, and he had been cold to her, not cruel but absent, occupied with his consequence and his lands, certain there would be time later to learn the trick of tenderness. There had not been time. She had died bearing a child that did not live, in a great house full of servants and empty of any person who loved her, calling for no one because she had learned that no one would come. He had been 3 counties away on business he could not afterward remember. He had come home to a closed room and a small grave, and the unanswerable knowledge that a woman had been in his keeping, and he had let her be alone, and he had folded that knowledge into himself, and built around it the stillness the village mistook for pride. He kept her miniature in a case in his breast pocket. The painted girl who had died waiting for warmth he meant always to bring tomorrow, and he touched the case sometimes without knowing he did it, the way a man touches an old scar before rain. This was the thing in him. He could not say to Eleanor what he felt, because saying it would mean asking her to come into his keeping, and the last woman he had asked into his keeping had died there alone. So he did the only thing his grief would permit. He gave without asking anything back. He built her a house. He built it on the far bank because the near bank was the village's, and he would not have her endure the village's eyes. He built it of good stone so that no winter could touch her. He had a well dug, and a stove set, and a workroom fitted with north light for her sewing, and a small walled garden where pears might one day grow. And he had it all done by men brought from elsewhere, who did not know whose it was, and when it was finished he sent her a single line in his own hand. The house across the river is yours, freely and without condition. There is a deed in the name of Eleanor Wycombe lodged with my solicitor. You need promise nothing and explain nothing. Come when you wish, or do not come. She read it standing in her doorway, with the autumn wind pulling at the paper. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it very small and put it in her workbox beside her father's letter, and she went back to her stitching. And she did not cross the river that day, or the next, or in all the long weeks that followed. The village watched the empty house and made its theories. The dowager, when she heard, went white with fury, and then, recovering, began to make a plan, for she saw in the woman's refusal not pride but opportunity. The Duke watched from his cold windows on the rise, and said nothing, and rode his lanes alone, and touched the case in his pocket before the rain. You are perhaps asking why she did not go. So was the whole of Crandon Ford. Hold the question gently. It has an answer, and the answer is the heart of her. She did not go because the house was a gift, and a gift was a promise, and a promise was the precise thing she had sworn never again to trust. She did not go because to live in a house a man had built was to belong to that man whether he asked it or no, and belonging was the trap her whole life had taught her to fear. She did not go because she had loved her father, and her father had loved her, and her father had still, through no fault of his goodness, left her with nothing but debts and a workbox. And she had learned from that gentle ruin that love was not safety, that the kindest hand could not be leaned on, that the only floor that would not give way beneath her was the one she nailed down herself. The house was beautiful. The house was warm. The house was across the river, and the river was the exact width of everything she did not dare to want. So she stayed in her cold front room and worked, and the Duke's standing order for shirts went on, and the pears came in their season, and the two of them lived a quarter mile and a whole world apart, each certain the other did not feel what each one felt, which is the oldest and most ordinary tragedy there is, and the one that needs the smallest push to mend. The push, when it came from the dowager, as such pushes do. She had not given up her nephew to a seamstress. She had merely changed her method. If the woman would not be warned off by kindness, she would be removed by circumstance, and the dowager understood circumstance as a general understands ground. She let it be known, quietly, in the right ears, that the empty house across the river was the Duke's folly, and the woman's shame that a man did not build a house for a virtuous woman and let it stand empty unless the arrangement it was built for had soured, and that the seamstress at the ford was, whatever her clean apron suggested, not a person the respectable houses ought to employ. It was beautifully done. No accusation was ever made that could be answered. The orders simply stopped. Mrs. Abbott, at the inn, who had called her poor, patient thing with real fondness, now called her something else, in a lower voice, with her eyes turned away, and that was the second voicing. And it cost Eleanor more than the first, because it came from a quarter she had thought a friend. By November, her work had fallen to nothing. The fine houses sent their mending to Crandon or to the next town. The coin she kept in the tin behind the loose brick grew light, then lighter. She let her own fire go cold to save the wood. She ate less and told herself she preferred it. And across the river the good stone house stood warm and empty, with its 9 windows dark, and she could not go to it now even had she wished, because to cross the river now would be to confirm every whisper the dowager had set loose, to walk into the house the village said was bought and paid for and prove the village right. The dowager had not merely tempted her to cross. She had made the bridge itself a thing that would damn her. It was very well done. Eleanor sat in her cold room and understood exactly how well. And for the first time since her father died, she felt the floor she had nailed down herself begin quietly to give way. The Duke did not know. This must be said plainly, because the niche of this story is not a man who watches a woman starve and does nothing. He did not know, because he had given her the house precisely so that he need never again insert himself into a woman's daily life and crush it with his weight, and so he had held himself away, had not called, had not inquired, had told himself that her silence was her freedom and that his part was to wait without demanding. He saw the dark windows and read them as her choice. He did not see the cold grate, or the light tin, or the thinning face, because the whole architecture of his penance was built to keep him from seeing, to keep him from being the kind of man who looked too closely at a woman and called it care. It was the child who told him, the same ragged boy, older now by half a year, and grown to haunt the great house's kitchens for scraps, the boy whose hand Eleanor had bound in the spring. He had not forgotten the penny or the woman who said it was a wage for being brave. He heard the kitchen talk, the way children hear everything, and one cold morning he stood in the stable yard and would not be moved until the Duke came out, and he said, in the flat, fierce way of a child reporting an injustice, that the sewing lady was sick with the cold and had no fire and no work because the grand lady had told everyone, and that it was a lie because she was the only one who had ever been good to him, and somebody ought to do something. The Duke went very still. Then he asked the boy 3 questions quietly, and got 3 answers, and the stillness went out of him all at once, and was replaced by something the boy had never seen in a grown man, and did not have a word for. He gave the boy a coin, a real one, and told him he had done right, And then he went into the house and did not come out for an hour, and when he came out, he had the look of a man who has finally understood the precise shape of his own mistake. He had built her a house and called it freedom. He had set her on the far bank to spare her his weight. And in his absence, the hierarchy had moved into the empty space and done to her, slowly, the very thing his presence might have prevented. His penance, the holding away he had thought was love, had left her exactly as alone as the wife he had failed. In a cold room calling for no one, certain no one would come, he had made the same grave twice. He understood it now to the bottom. And he understood, standing in his cold hall with his hand pressed flat against the case in his pocket, that there was only one way left to undo it, and that it would have to be done not quietly, not at a distance, not with a deed lodged discreetly with a solicitor, but in the open, in front of the very people whose whispers had built her prison, where it could not be taken back. The dowager had arranged a dinner. Of course she had. She had arranged it to crown her victory, a large dinner at the great house for the better families of the district, with Miss Lavinia Croft placed at the Duke's right hand in pale blue silk, fair and composed and entirely correct, the visible answer to a question the dowager intended to settle for good. The whole neighborhood came. The candles were lit the length of the long table, the silver shone, the talk ran warm and pleased with itself, and at the head of it sat the Duke, saying little, watching the door. Eleanor had not been invited. She would not have come. The Duke had sent the boy to her that afternoon, all the same, with a folded note and an instruction. And the note said, "Only in the same hand as the deed. I have wronged you, in a way I must set right where they can all hear it. Come to the door at 9 and no further. You need not enter. You need only let them see you are not what they have said." He had asked her for the first time, for something, and he had asked it in a form that left her free to refuse, and she had stood in her cold room with the note in her hand and understood that this was different, that this was not a gift laid down and walked away from, but a hand held out and waiting, and that she had spent her whole life confusing the two. She put on the gray gown, the good one, the one she had ruined in the mud for a child and mended afterwards so carefully, the mend did not show. She did her hair by feel in the dark, because the candle was the last she had. She crossed the river on the stepping stones in the dark, the water low and cold. Around the hem she had not let herself raise, counting the stones the way she had counted them as a girl in another county on another river. And she came up the rise to the great house with its blazing windows, the windows she had watched from her own dark room all those weeks. And she stood in the open door of the dining room at 9 o'clock, with the autumn night behind her, and the cold still on her skin, and the long table fell silent, one face at a time, the talk dying down its length like a candle snuffer drawn along a row of flames. The dowager saw her first and rose half out of her chair. "So the creature has come after all," she said, into the hush, her voice pitched to carry to the company assembled to witness her victory. "She has come uninvited to a gentleman's table, I think," she said, turning to the room with her fan opening like a verdict, "that this settles what she is, and what the house across the river was always for." And that was the third voicing, delivered in the cruelest of the three settings, before the whole assembled neighborhood, calibrated to finish her. It did not finish her. The Duke had risen. He came down the length of the long table, past the silver and the candles, and Miss Croft in her pale blue silk, past his aunt with her open fan, and the room turned to follow him the way a field of wheat turns in wind. He did not hurry. He crossed the whole length of the room in the silence the dowager's words had made, and he stopped in front of Eleanor in the open door, and for a moment he only looked at her, at the gray gown and the river-wet hem and the face that had thinned in the weeks he had not let himself see. And the company saw the still face of the Duke of Harrowmere do a thing none of them had ever seen it do. It broke, quietly, completely, in front of everyone. It broke. Then he took her hand, her bare, cold hand, in both of his, and he turned with her to the silent room, and he said the words, "This is the woman I intend to marry." He said it once. He did not explain it, or soften it, or hang another word upon it. 8 words, level and irrevocable. Spoken in the room where the verdict against her had been pronounced, in front of every person who had pronounced it. And in the silence after, while the candles burned and no one breathed, he lifted her cold hand and held it against the place in his coat where the case lay where the painted girl had ridden over his heart for 14 years. And he held it there as if he were giving something into her keeping that he had never given to anyone. And the gesture said, more plainly than the words that he knew now what it had cost the last woman to wait for him, and that this one would not wait because he had crossed to her. The dowager's fan had stopped. Her mouth opened and shut, and produced nothing. She looked at the room, at the faces she had commanded a quarter hour before, the faces that had leaned toward her like flowers toward a window, and found them turned away from her now, found the wheat all leaning the other way. Every head in the long room inclined toward the door and the man and the woman in it. The recognition went across her handsome face in a single visible wave. The recognition of a woman whose script had worked in every drawing room she had ever entered, and had just in this one room, in front of everyone who mattered to her, failed. Her hand, when at last it moved, set the fan down on the cloth very carefully, as though it had become a thing she no longer knew how to hold. Miss Croft, who was not a wicked girl, but only a girl who had been told the wrong thing all her life, set down her glass very carefully and looked at the Duke and the seamstress and understood, perhaps before the dowager did, that she had been an arrangement and not a choice, and that the choice had just been made in front of her and was not hers. She did the one graceful thing left to her. She rose and she crossed to Eleanor and she said low, that she wished her very happy, and she meant it, which surprised no one more than herself. The Duke's old solicitor was at the dinner. The dowager had invited him for the weight of his respectability, not knowing she was seating the witness to her own undoing. He came forward now in his sober black and confirmed, to the room that the deed to the river house stood lawfully in Miss Wycombe's sole name. Freely given, no condition attached, no claim retained, and that any person suggesting otherwise spoke against the plain record. It was the procedural seal. It could not now be whispered away. The hierarchy had pronounced its verdict, and the hierarchy's own forms had just been turned in open court to overturn it. Eleanor stood through all of it with her hand in his, and her eyes bright and her chin level, and she did not gloat because she did not know how, and because the thing she felt was too large and too quiet for gloating. She had crossed the river. She saw now that she had not crossed it to take the house. She had crossed it because a man had finally asked in a way that left her free, and because being asked was not the trap she had spent her life mistaking it for, and because the floor she had nailed down alone all these years had been, all along, only half a floor, and here was the other half, held out waiting, and hers to take or leave. She took it. She had decided somewhere on the cold stepping stones in the dark that she would rather risk being unsafe with someone than be perfectly safe alone for the rest of her life. It was the bravest thing she had ever done, and it did not feel brave at all. It felt like coming in out of the rain. They were married before the first snow, in the small gray church at the ford, without a crowd, because neither of them wanted a crowd ever again. The boy who had told the Duke the truth stood near the front in a coat that fit him, scrubbed and astonished, and was given afterward a place in the household and an education. On the grounds, the Duke said, that a person who tells a hard truth at cost to himself is worth more than most people of fashion, and the boy did not understand the half of it, but understood that he was wanted, which was the part that mattered. The dowager went back to town. She was not destroyed, because the niche of this world does not destroy. She was corrected. She wrote in the spring a stiff letter of congratulation that cost her a great deal, and was received with more grace than it deserved, and she came eventually to dinner, and sat at the table she had once commanded, and found her nephew warmer than she had ever known him and his wife, and she went home quieter than she had come, which is the only humbling a just world owes a proud woman who was wrong. And the house across the river was no longer across anything. They lived in it. The great cold house on the rise was shut up, and the staff brought down to the good stone house with the green shutters and the north light, because Eleanor would not give up her workroom, and the Duke discovered he did not wish her to, that he liked to sit by her fire of an evening and watch her hands at their work. The hands that had bound a child's wound in the mud, and that the small warm room suited him better than any great hall ever had. The pears grew in the walled garden, and in their first autumn she put up the surplus in jars along the workroom shelf, and thought, every time she set one down, of the unsigned baskets on her cold step, and how long she had refused to wonder. She mended his shirts herself, now the standing order ended, and laughed at him for the absurd number he had ordered when he had no way to reach her but to buy what she made, and he bore the laughter gravely, which only made her laugh the more. On the first snowfall of their first married winter, she stood at the north window of her workroom, with a half-finished hem across her lap, and watched the flakes come down over the river, over the stepping stones gone white, over the near bank, where she had stood a year before with a basket on her hip. The fire was warm at her back. Somewhere in the house the boy was reading aloud, stumbling over the long words, and the Duke was correcting him gently, and the sound came down the passage like something she had once stopped believing she was allowed to have. She set down the hem. She opened her workbox, the same one she had carried out of her father's ruined house with everything she owned, and she took from it the folded letter, the one in the Duke's hand, the deed to the house that was hers, freely and without condition, and she did not need to read it again because she lived inside its sentence now. She held it a moment in the firelight. Then she set it back in the box beside her father's letter. The two of them together. The love that could not keep her, and the love that had learned how. And she closed the lid, and she went down the warm passage toward the voices, and she did not once look back at the river. Thank you for staying to the end of her story. If Eleanor's long walk across the cold stones moved you, leave a word below and tell me the moment it turned, and let her quiet courage keep you warm a while.